Other colleague was Chandrasekhar Azad. Chandrasekhar Azad had not been captured. He made his way through Jhansi and other places eventually to what was then called Allahabad, now called Prayagraj. And he was then famously, as you may know the story, he was trapped in Alfred Park in Allahabad. And then he fought till the last bullet, and then he shot himself and killed himself with the last bullet. Now the question is, how did the British know that he was in Alfred Park? That very often the story is that there was a gentleman called Veerbhadra Tiwari who provided the information. But there is a problem with this story, because although Veerbhadra probably did work for the British and provide them information, he didn't actually know where Chandrasekhar Azad was, because Chandrasekhar Azad had not kept him in the loop. So how did the British get information? Because it doesn't quite add up. So we actually do have some other information of how this person was. The other person and very likely source of this information was a person that you may know as the very famous writer called Yashpal. You know of the writer called Yashpal? He made a name for himself in independent India as a writer, particularly about the revolutionary movement. But do you know that he was actually the most likely source of the information? So much so, in fact, even before Chandrasekhar Azad died, he already suspected that there was something fishy about him. And he had instructed several members of his group to actually look out for him and kill him if necessary. But we know also for a fact that Yashpal knew that Chandrasekhar Azad was in Allahabad, because they had actually together gone and seen Jawaharlal Nehru the previous day. But the best information about this actually interestingly comes from many decades later. Somewhere in the 1960s, a CID officer called Dharmendra Gaur, who was in the Lucknow office of CID, came across a bunch of letters from the late 1940s, or rather 1940s, from just the period when the British were about to hand over to the Indians. This is, I think, from 1946, if I'm not mistaken. And this letter is very interesting because it is one British intelligence officer telling another that we are now going to leave this country. We need to make arrangements for one of our useful informants, a gentleman, somebody called Mr. Yashpal. And he describes the person who is quite clearly the writer. And he says he was very useful to us in certain cases. And then he names all the dates where he was useful, which clearly correlate to Yashpal's, particularly the particular incident of Azad being killed. So as I said, pointed out to you, that Dharmendra Gaur then, of course, wrote a book about this. And most interestingly, Yashpal, who was still alive at that time and a very famous author and so on, an intellectual of that time, while he did not entirely, refute the facts. So, again, do remember sometimes who these people are. It is very important to remember this. Now, the 1930s, of course, saw a brief lull in the mid-30s. The Indians, both the peaceful movement and the revolutionary movement by the mid-30s, were exhausted. They had tried over the previous decades, there are many moves, whether the non-cooperation movement on one hand or the various revolutionary activities on the other. They had simply failed to budge the British. And so they were exhausted. And then only in the very late 30s did they begin to again gather momentum. Raj Bihari Bose was then based in Japan, and of course the Japanese entered the war, and so on. But one of the interesting things that happened during this period is what the British were doing in order to infiltrate the revolutionary movement, because they were still afraid that this movement may come back. And they did something that is quite curious and